Peterson.
Sorry. My question is to SHASHI Tharoor. Happy Onam first.
Oh, thank you. You too.
You mentioned about Britain. Mentioned that Britain left India in a worse off condition than had it been without Britain. You also mentioned about reparation from Britain. What about the skills in engineering and manufacturing India acquired, the administrative and democratic processes it inherited, the infrastructure left behind, and most of all, the rapid education of the Indian people, of which you are an excellent example? Surely, no one can price these intangible values that were gained during the British rule in India and propel the country to its present position as one of the leading countries in the world. Finally, one more question. I'm doing a Geoffrey Robertson here. In your opinion, where would India be today if the British did not step into India?
Oh, there's a lot there. It'll take the rest of the program to answer. I'll try and touch on it. But this is almost like the American saying to the widow of the American president, apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the play? I mean, you know, really, the British came to one of the richest countries in the world, accounting for 27% of global GDP in 1700, 23% in 1800, and over 200 years of exploitation, depredation, loot and destruction, reduced it to a poster child for third world poverty, just over 3% of global GDP, 90% of the population living below the poverty line when the British left in 1947, a literacy rate, you speak of education, a literacy rate below 17%, and a life expectancy of 27. The growth rate of British India from 1900 to 1947 was 0.001%. That's what they were doing while draining the country of taxes and resources. Education, my gosh, the British, the last thing they wanted to do was invest in educating Indians. Will Durant, the American historian, traveling in India as late as 1930, pointed out that the entire expenditure of the British on education in India, from the nursery level to the highest universities, was less than half the high school budget of the state of New York. All the Indian institutes of technology, the engineering achievements you're talking about, were established after independence by the government of India. There is simply no comparison between the accomplishments of India rising from the ashes the British left us in and what was done in 200 years. I've given many figures.
Just take one example, the textile industry, because India was a huge exporter of
For 2,000 years, it was the world's leading exporter.
What happened?
In fact, in the Roman Empire, there are debates recorded by Pliny the Elder of Roman senators complaining about the amount of the Roman Empire's gold that was being sent off to India because of the tastes of Roman women for Indian muslins, linens, and cottons.
Was it just modernism, the Industrial Revolution, that destroyed it, or was it something else?
No, that's the excuse that apologists like to make, that, you know, oh, it's not our fault, you just missed the bus for the Industrial Revolution. Well, we missed the bus because you threw us under its wheels, is what I tell the Brits. I mean, the fact is, in the name of free trade, the British came in and destroyed the free trade that had made India a leading exporter of textiles. The British soldiers smashed the looms so people couldn't practice their craft. They imposed punitive duties and taxes on the export of Indian textiles while lifting duties on the import of British cloth. And they achieved a captive market at the point of a gun. This is not exactly free trade, as you can imagine. Cities like Murshidabad and Dhaka in the subcontinent were depopulated. In one notorious incident, weavers had their thumbs cut off, so when the looms were repaired, they couldn't weave again. Textiles were systematically destroyed as an industry by the British. And that's only one example of many.
Well, I'm going to quickly go back to our question. Now, Kevin, do you accept that perhaps the British weren't quite as benign as you've just suggested?
Please read the book, Kevin. There's a lot more there.
I've got the book.
I'll bring Laurie in here. He gave a speech along these lines to the Oxford Union, got wild applause from the students and others sitting around the Oxford Union Hall. And I'm just wondering, have young Brits come to terms with their colonial past?
No, we haven't at all. Young Brits of every class have no idea about our colonial past, and that is being deliberately done. We are deliberately denied or kept away from education about the graphic facts of what the British did around the world, including in this country, to the people of this country. The crimes of the British and the crimes that we committed and that were done in our names over 400 years of pillage and conquest is something that we don't like to think about, and yet it is everywhere in modern British history. When people talk about Brexit, it's stunning to me that if you ask British people who voted for Brexit what their major fear is, their fear is that people will come to our country and take our things. And
that's exactly
why? I just can't. It doesn't compute, but we don't know this history. I took history in British schools up to the age of 18, and I got a pretty good grade. And
You never learned a line of colonial history, did you?
Well, almost everything that you have just said, I learned from your book.
I'm going to throw quickly back to Shashi because, one of the great heroes of the Second World War, in fact, of the 20th century, Winston Churchill, you've basically accused him in your book of complicity in a famine that killed 4 million Bengalis.
Rightly so.
4.3. I mean, Churchill personally took the decisions that actually not only plunged Bengal into starvation, but had the British actually purchase grain that the Bengalis could barely afford to buy in order to ship it to Europe, not to aid the war effort, as his defenders claim, but to boost the buffer stocks in the event of a future possible invasion of Greece and Yugoslavia. People started dying, and Churchill said, well, it's all their fault anyway for breeding like rabbits. He said, I hate the Indians. They're a beastly people with a beastly religion. Australian ships were docking in Calcutta port and were ordered by Churchill and his odious paymaster, General Lord Chauvel, not to disembark their wheat, but to sail on to Europe, where their wheat might be used in some future reserve stock. On top of that, when conscience-stricken British officials...
Yes, I was going to say, did Churchill know people were dying?
Yes, conscience-stricken British officials are constantly sending memoranda to the Prime Minister personally, because it was his decision, saying that people were dying literally on the streets, and all Churchill could bring himself to do was write peevishly on the side of the file, why hasn't Gandhi died yet?
Wow.
And this is the man the British want us to hail as an apostle of freedom and democracy, when he has as much blood on his hands as some of the worst genocidal dictators of the 20th century.
Well, thank you.
Yes.
Next question is from Karima Farouk.
Far from online happy snaps, we nowadays lob Molotov cocktails on the internet to get a reaction, and online trolls direct personal insults and slurs to those whose voices and opinions they disagree with. The US president communicates essential messages with a few lines on Twitter. Pauline Hanson saunters into federal parliament in a burqa, in a move more suited to a performance artist than a politician. And yes, it has affected public opinion. Do you think we'll ever return to a time of discourse and an attempt at consensus? Just like slow food, do you think we need to try slow politics? Or has the instant nature of our world changed the way we digest things forever?
Shashi, give us a slow answer.
Well, some politicians are performance artists, I'm afraid, so it may well be that what she's saying is... I was an early adopter on Twitter, and there was a time when you could actually have real conversations with real people on social media. Now, certainly in the Indian context, it's all taken over by organized armies of politically minded tweeters. It's taken over by, as you said, the trolls who are out there to spew venom and hatred that in real life they really couldn't. I mean, I've once or twice actually met some of these people, and they're absolute lambs in person. But there's something about the anonymity of the internet that emboldens them to spew the most vituperative, vile stuff at people, and it doesn't cost them anything, sadly, literally or otherwise, and they get away with it. How can we slow this down? I mean, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. Social media is here to stay. Perhaps if it weren't so useful to politicians, for example, more of us would walk away from it, but we can't afford to, because whatever percentage of that hate out there, however high it may be, there's still some real people reading what you have to say, some of the things you're saying is, I mean, making the news or helping influence the national agenda. So you keep plugging away. I don't have a better answer to you right now. Right now, for example, the number of people on Facebook in India has crossed 200 million. I mean, you just can't.
Next question comes from Cassie Snarkis.
With Donald Trump saying he'll respond to the delicate situation of North Korea's nuclear war threats with aggressive claims of fire and fury, isn't the Australia-US alliance placing Australia in a dangerous position?
Michael.
Well, thank you, Cassie. I would agree that Donald Trump's policy, there's been as much confusion, if you like, about Donald Trump's policies on North Korea as there was about the location of the USS Carl Vinson a couple of months ago, the warship that he said was steaming to the Korean Peninsula, and it turns out to be somewhere else. He's been incoherent. On the one hand, he calls for fire and fury. On the other hand, he says that he's willing to meet Kim Jong-un and make a deal. But let's not forget who is driving this crisis, because we've criticised Mr. Trump a lot tonight. But who's driving this is Kim Jong-un, a young man in a very big hurry who is absolutely ruthless, who is prepared to use a weapon of mass destruction at a major commercial airport in order to assassinate his brother, who is willing to provoke not only the United States to defy UN Security Council resolutions, but even to provoke his ally, China. So I think it's important to focus on where the threat here is coming from. It's coming from North Korea. Now, do I have an enormous amount of faith in Mr. Trump to apply the right balance of carrots and sticks? I don't. But I think to immediately pivot and start to, criticise Trump or the alliance as opposed to the person who's actually
Sure, but
bringing...
that is a question about whether the person who you regard as behaving dangerously could cause Australia through the alliance to get involved in a conflict. So I guess that's the heart of that question.
Well, I think that Australia has interests in North Korea. I mean, the idea that in the Korean Peninsula, the idea that it's nothing to do with us, I don't agree with that. I mean, North Korea has threatened Australia. It increasingly has the capability to lob missiles as far as the Australian continent. We are a US ally, but we also have an interest in a peaceful, stable and secure North Korea. So I don't think we should by any means automatically enter some sort of conflict with North Korea. I think we should not be an automatic ally of the United States, but do we have equities and interests in a peaceful, stable North Korea? Is it in our interest that together the United States and China can somehow find the leverage to force or to push Kim Jong-un to come up with some sort of freeze of his programs? Absolutely, we have an interest in that.
Shashi, former diplomat, what do you think?
Well, I think we've got to think for a minute that maybe the actors in this are not as irrational as they seem to all of us. And Kim Jong-un probably is looking, for example, at Saddam Hussein's experience, is saying this guy boasted about weapons of mass destruction and he got overthrown by the Americans for his pains. Let me show them I have weapons of mass destruction and they won't dare to overthrow me. So it's a way of buying himself, in a sense, perpetuity, regime insurance, if you like, or insurance against regime change. In some ways, therefore, what he's doing with all of this is saying, don't try and overthrow me because the price you'll have to pay is far too high to pay. He's saying, Seoul is easy for me to take out. Guam is easy for me to nuke. Japan is within the range of my missiles. That's why he just fired one above it. San Francisco isn't too far away either, folks. So do you want to play that kind of hardball with me? Or will you leave me alone to be myself?
Is that the sort of hardball that India plays with Pakistan?
Oh, I wish. No.
Because, I mean, both North Korea, India and Pakistan, well, the three of them, have all broken international laws in order to build a nuclear arsenal.
No, it's a little more complicated than that. India has...
Not that much more complicated.
Well, it is. India rightly, I think, considered the non-proliferation treaty to be an abomination. It's the last existence of apartheid in international law, where a bunch of countries says that we are entitled to have something that the rest of you are not. I mean, that's racism plain and simple, and it will not be acceptable.
That's the argument of North Korea.
Exactly. So what I'm trying to say is maybe we'll have to live with a nuclear North Korea. As Tom Lehrer said in the famous lyric, "The Lord's our shepherd," says the song, "but just in case, we better have a bomb." That's exactly what Kim Jong-un is thinking. I don't admire the man. He's everything that Michael says he is. He's a nasty character. He's a Stalinist dictator. He's putting his people in great misery and poverty. But at the same time, if you think of him as a rational actor, what he's doing is a fairly rational calculation. And I think it should give pause to anybody who might be contemplating any military adventure against North Korea. The price would be far too high to